My name is Roger, and last Christmas I waited 13 long hours at Denver International Airport for my daughter who promised wait for me. Dad, I'll be there soon. 35 unanswered calls later, I realized the truth. My own flesh and blood had no intention of picking me up. What waited for me at her house that night was not the warm embrace of family, but a cruel revelation that shattered everything I believed about love, loyalty, and inheritance. Yet in that betrayal, I found something far greater: freedom. Before I take you through the night, my daughter lost not only $175,000 in gifts, but nearly $3 million in inheritance. Let me ask you, where are you watching from and how old are you? Please subscribe to Family Betrayal Unmasked to hear more powerful stories like this one. I still remember stepping off that plane with my arms full of gifts and my heart light with anticipation. It was Christmas Day, 2:47 in the afternoon, when Denver International buzzed with laughter, embraces, and reunions all around me. Families reunited with tears and joy, while I gripped 6 carefully chosen gift bags, each one planned with weeks of thought. For Victoria, my daughter, there was the burgundy bag carrying her grandmother's emerald necklace, a family treasure passed down through 3 generations. For Martin, her husband, I brought a cashmere scarf from his favorite boutique. For little Emma, the doll she had begged for during our last call. And tucked deep in my coat pocket were 3 sealed envelopes on official bank letterhead, holding $175,000 in checks meant to bless them this Christmas. I thought of Margaret, my late wife, whose laughter once filled holidays with warmth. Selling the business we had built, together a network of auto parts stores, was one of the hardest decisions of my life, but I told myself the sacrifice was worth it if I could use that money to take care of my family. This Christmas was supposed to prove that love, though changed by death and distance, still held us together. The terminal glowed with holiday spirit. Children squealed, parents snapped photos, couples kissed under tacky mistletoe. A grandfather nearby swung his grandson in circles, both of them laughing until their faces turned red. I tightened my grip on my bags, my chest swelling with hope. Soon that would be me. Emma running into my arms, Victoria smiling proudly, Martin shaking my hand with gratitude. I pulled out my phone, dialed Victoria's number, and waited for her warm voice. "Dad," she answered flatly, distracted, as though I had interrupted her rather than delighted her. "I'm here, sweetheart," I said, forcing cheer into my tone. "Just landed. Flight was smooth. I can't wait to see you all." Her response was curt: "We're running late. Wait at the exit. We'll be there soon." No excitement, no warmth, just obligation. The line went dead before I could even ask if she wanted me to wait by baggage claim. At first I told myself not to worry. Holiday traffic, children's chaos, last-minute preparations, it all made sense. But as I stood by the sliding glass doors, watching families greet one another, my joy began to feel misplaced. Minutes turned into hours. I checked my phone again and again, staring at the photo of Emma I had taken the Christmas before, her toothy grin shining under a tree filled with homemade ornaments. That photo reminded me of everything I thought I still meant to this family. Yet each time the doors swished open, strangers walked past me, none of them my daughter. The bags at my feet felt heavier, the envelopes in my pocket sharper against my chest. What should have been a day of reunion was turning into something else entirely, a test of patience, a quiet humiliation. Families streamed out of the terminal into waiting cars, but I stood there alone, the bitter December air creeping through my coat. And then came the first thought I didn't want to face: what if Victoria simply didn't care whether I was there at all? By the time my watch struck 3 o'clock, I had already called Victoria 4 times. Each call rang until it bled into voicemail. I left messages, at first gentle ones, cheerful, even sweetheart, I'm here, I'll wait outside. Drive safe. But as the minutes stretched, my words grew shorter, my voice tighter. At 3:17, my phone finally buzzed with a reply. A single text, still running late. Be patient. Be patient. Not sorry, Dad, not. We can't wait to hug you, not even traffic's a nightmare. Just 2 words as cold as the snow swirling outside those sliding glass doors. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering as though I could summon warmth from her by sheer will. Instead, I slipped the phone back into my coat pocket and adjusted the fortress of bags I'd arranged around my feet. The longer I waited, the more I noticed the contrast. A woman my age embraced her son so tightly, I thought she might break his ribs. A young father rushed past, carrying a car seat in one hand and luggage in the other, his wife chattering about Christmas dinner. Every joyful reunion stung like salt on an open wound. I kept telling myself my moment would come too. Victoria would pull up any second, Emma would leap into my arms, Martin would shake my hand. But every time those doors whooshed open, my heart leapt for nothing. By 4 Ozer, I had called her 8 times. By 5 Surum, the number had doubled. I bought a coffee just to keep my hands busy, the bitter liquid doing little to thaw the chill creeping into my chest. Around me, the terminal thinned as the afternoon turned to evening. The laughter of reunited families faded, replaced by the tired shuffle of travelers catching last flights. 30 calls later, I stopped leaving messages. My words sounded desperate even to me, and pride was the only warmth I had left. Still, I couldn't stop dialing. Each ring was a lifeline, a hope that maybe this time she'd answer with laughter and an apology. But hope cracked each time the call went to voicemail. At 6:45, hunger gnawed at me, so I bought a stale sandwich from a coffee kiosk. I ate alone, staring at the families on the other side of the glass. People gathered around tables sharing food stories, love. I looked down at the envelopes in my pocket, feeling their weight like stones. $175,000, a Christmas of generosity planned to show them they mattered more than anything else. Instead, I was eating cold bread while my daughter ignored me. When the 35th call went unanswered, my chest tightened with something darker than worry. Emergencies didn't last this long. Hospitals had phones. Even if traffic was terrible, one of them could have called back. No, this silence wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. A decision. I leaned back in the hard plastic chair, the terminal now nearly empty, and let the thought seep in fully for the first time. What if they weren't coming at all? I shifted the weight of my suitcase and sat down near the broad windows overlooking the snowy pickup lanes. The airport felt quieter now, as though Christmas itself had moved on without me. The few travelers left hurried through with a sense of purpose. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they belonged. Everyone except me. I lined up the bags around my feet again, a little fortress of ribbons and tissue paper. Each one had meaning. The emerald necklace wasn't just jewelry. It was a piece of Margaret's legacy. She wore it at our wedding. Her mother had worn it before her. Passing it down to Victoria was supposed to remind her that she came from a line of strong, enduring women. The scarf for Martin wasn't about money. It was about respect, showing him he was included as family. And the doll for Emma that was pure joy, a grandfather's wish to see his granddaughter's eyes light up. But the more I stared at those bags, the heavier they seemed. Not in weight, but in memory. Every sacrifice I had made for Victoria came rushing back. The weekends I spent buried in invoices instead of taking my wife out for dinner. The nights I worked overtime to pay for her private college sorority fees and graduate school. The years Margaret warned me, you're spoiling her, Roger. She never thanks you. I ignored it every time, telling myself gratitude would come later, when she was older, when she understood. Yet the evidence stacked against me like unpaid bills. Her graduation day, I drove 8 hours only to get 15 rushed minutes before she ran off with her friends. Her wedding, I stood there in my simple suit, giving a heartfelt toast about family and hard work, while her new in-laws delivered polished speeches about art and philosophy. I saw the flicker of embarrassment in her eyes when I spoke. That memory burned even now, and every Christmas since Margaret passed. It was as if my presence was a courtesy, not a desire. Victoria accepted gifts as if they were obligations fulfilled rather than love offered. When had my daughter stopped seeing me as her father and started seeing me only as a wallet? I pulled out my phone again, scrolled through the call log. 35 unanswered calls glared back at me like accusations, each one a reminder that while I sat here clinging to hope, she sat somewhere else choosing silence. If Emma had been sick, they could have called. If Martin's car had broken down, there were taxis, Ubers, neighbors. No explanation accounted for deliberate neglect. The voices of nearby travelers floated through the air. A young couple laughed over their baby's drawings, the kind of scene Margaret and I once dreamed of with grandchildren. My throat tightened as I realized that Dream was dying right here in this airport chair. I leaned forward, pressing my elbows to my knees, and whispered to myself, "What have I done? Did I give her everything except the one thing that mattered, teaching her how to value people over money?" As the snow thickened outside, the answer grew clearer with every passing minute. This wasn't just lateness. It was something far worse, the culmination of years of quiet disregard. The words echoed in my mind like a riddle. "Don't you dare call a taxi." At first, I brushed it off as impatience, a daughter's quick remark made under stress. But as the hours crawled on, those words gnawed at me. Why forbid something that made perfect sense? If they were truly stuck in traffic, if their car had broken down, wouldn't they have welcomed the solution? I stared at the snow whipping across the darkened pickup lanes, my reflection faint in the glass. Behind me, the airport announcements crackled about delayed flights, yet none of those voices carried the bite of betrayal that mine did. Families, even in inconvenience, still found their way together. I, on the other hand, sat exiled in plain sight, carrying proof of my devotion in bags no one cared to collect. The more I thought about it, the clearer the pattern became. Victoria hadn't sounded eager when I first called her. Voice was flat, distracted, as though my arrival was an obligation, not a joy. The text that followed, "Be patient," wasn't written by a daughter excited to see her father. It was a command, a dismissal. Now, combined with that strange warning against taxis, it all pointed to a conclusion I didn't want to accept. They didn't want me there. I tried to shake it off, to give her the benefit of the doubt the way I always had. Maybe Emma was sick. Maybe Martin's parents had needed help. Maybe. But my gut told me different, and a father knows when his child is lying, even from miles away. I rubbed my hands together more out of nerves than cold. Every wrinkle in my palms carried years of labor, grease-stained days, running Baker's Auto Parts nights, balancing ledgers by lamplight. 30 years of sacrifice so my daughter could climb ladders I never had the chance to. And this was my reward, sitting alone being told to wait, like an inconvenience best left forgotten. The emerald necklace pressed against my ribs where it rested in my coat pocket. Margaret's voice rose in my memory. "Promise me you'll make sure Victoria remembers where she came from." I thought this necklace would do it, a reminder of her roots of family. But now I wondered if it would be tossed aside like the pearl earrings she barely glanced at 2 Christmases ago. I took out my phone once more, scrolled through the endless unanswered calls, and felt my stomach twist. No accident keeps a family from calling for 7 hours. No flat tire silences a daughter on Christmas Day. The silence wasn't circumstantial, it was deliberate. The realization hit like ice water in my veins. My daughter, the very child I'd poured my life into, was trying to keep me away. And the only question left was why. I sat back in the hard chair, the fortress of bags around me suddenly looking foolish, like monuments to a love that had become one-sided. And as I stared at the empty doors, I whispered aloud, the fear that had been clawing at me all night. What if they're not coming at all? At some point, waiting turns from patience into humiliation. By the time the airport clock read past 9 at night, I knew I had crossed that line. 13 hours, 35 unanswered calls, one curt text, and not a single sign of my daughter or her family. My coffee had long gone cold. My sandwich sat like a brick in my stomach, and the once bright gift bags at my feet now looked ridiculous, colorful evidence of a man too stubborn to see the truth. I stood slowly, stiff from sitting so long. My hands trembled as I gathered the bags, looping handles over my arms, until I looked like some weary Santa Claus no one wanted. The suitcase handle dug into my palm as I pulled it behind me. Each step toward the exit felt heavier than the last, not from the weight of the gifts, but from the realization that my place in my daughter's life had shrunk to something smaller than those ribbons and bows. Still, one detail nagged at me sharper than all the others. "Don't you dare call a taxi." The words had sounded strange when she first said them. Now they were sinister. Why not? Why would my own daughter forbid me to find a way to her house? Unless the real plan was never to pick me up at all. Unless she hoped that if she stalled long enough, I'd give up, take a flight back, disappear quietly into the night. The thought made my chest tighten. I paused at the glass doors one last time, watching as another family spilled out into the snowy pickup lanes. Their children shrieked with delight, running into the arms of grandparents who had just arrived. The grandfather's laugh carried across the cold air, rich and full. That sound should have been mine tonight. Instead, I was left with silence. I pulled my phone from my pocket, the call log glowing with its accusing numbers. 35 attempts, none returned. My thumb hovered over Victoria's name one final time, but I couldn't press it again. There was nothing left to say. Instead, I scrolled to the number for Denver Cab Company. The dispatcher answered with cheerful efficiency, and I gave her the address in Cherry Hills Village, the very home I had helped my daughter purchase with a $20,000 down payment years ago. "Taxi will be there in 12 minutes, she said. 12 minutes. After 13 hours, 12 more felt like nothing. When the yellow cab finally pulled to the curb, the driver, a man about my age with kind eyes, helped load the bags into the trunk. "Christmas visit?" he asked. "Something like that," I muttered. As we pulled away from the terminal, the lights of Denver International grew smaller in the rear window, and the truth settled heavy in my chest. Either something had gone terribly wrong, or I was about to find out just how little I meant to the family I had sacrificed everything for. And deep down, I already knew which one it was. The cab rolled to a stop in front of Victoria's house just after 10 o'clock. Snow crunched under the tires as the driver eased into the driveway, pulling up behind a silver Mercedes and a blue BMW, both sitting there in perfect condition. My heart gave a hard thud. "So much for the story of a broken car. Looks like a full house," the driver said, kindly gesturing toward the warm glow spilling from the windows. His voice held no malice, but his words cut deeper than he knew. I paid him, forced a smile, and stepped into the cold. My breath billowed out in clouds, each one carrying the weight of hours wasted at the airport. I stood there for a moment, the bags dangling from my arms, watching golden light dance across the snow. The house looked like a magazine cover wreath on the door, white lights strung with precision silver decorations, visible through the front window. Inside, I could see figures moving around a long dining table. Laughter drifted faintly through the glass, muffled but unmistakable. Crystal glasses caught the light as they were raised in toasts. Plates clinked, chairs scraped, voices mingled in warmth. My throat tightened as I pressed closer to the window. There was Martin at the far end, leaning back in his chair, grinning at something. Beside him sat Victoria, her face relaxed, wine glass in hand, eyes sparkling with comfort. And little Emma, my Emma, sat between them, giggling as Lindsay helped her scoop mashed potatoes onto her plate. At the head of the table, Roy gestured animatedly clearly in the middle of telling one of his stories, while Lindsay listened with amused affection. It was the very image I had pictured for myself when I booked this trip. Only I wasn't there. I wasn't even in the frame. The table was perfectly set for the exact number of people inside. No empty chair waiting for me. No extra plate in the kitchen. They hadn't forgotten me, they had planned to exclude me. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The snowflakes swirling around me seemed to mock the heat of that glowing room. I shifted the weight of the burgundy bag against my leg, feeling the sharp outline of the emerald necklace box inside. That heirloom was supposed to bind Victoria to the women who came before her, to me, to Margaret. But watching her laugh without a care, I realized she had already severed that bond. My legs felt weak. I steadied myself against the porch railing, the cold wood biting into my palm. The hours at the airport replayed in my mind, the unanswered calls, the hollow text, the warning not to call a taxi. It hadn't been traffic or chaos or miscommunication. It had been a choice, a deliberate, cruel choice to leave me stranded so they could enjoy their Christmas without the burden of me. The truth stung sharper than the winter air. My daughter hadn't just failed to pick me up. She had abandoned me. I tightened my grip on the suitcase handle and climbed the steps to the front door. The wreath hanging there mocked me, green pine needles laced with silver ribbon, cheerful berries pressed neatly in clusters. I remembered when Victoria was 7, and I bought her first Christmas wreath from a hardware store clearance bin. She had insisted on hanging it herself, lopsided, as it was smiling with pride. Now, here I was, decades later, standing before a door that symbolized a holiday I'd been shut out of. My finger pressed the doorbell, and inside a chime rang out over the laughter. The voices faltered. Footsteps approached. Then the door opened, and there she was, my daughter. Victoria's face shifted in an instant, passing through surprise, confusion, and finally something dangerously close to panic. Her cheeks were flushed from wine, her eyes darting past me to the cab, now driving away. "Dad," she blurted, her voice pitched too high, brittle. "You're here. I'm so sorry. We had a flat tire on the way to get you." I stepped forward, forcing her to back up. The warmth of the house brushed against my chilled face as I crossed the threshold. A flat tire, I gestured toward the driveway where 2 cars gleamed under the soft glow of Christmas lights. Funny, both of them looked just fine to me. Her mouth opened, then closed. Martin appeared in the hallway behind her. His tie loosened his face tight. "Your dad's here," Victoria said quickly, her voice wobbling. We completely forgot to call back. My phone died. Then Martin's car had trouble. The excuses tumbled out, like poorly rehearsed lines, each one contradicting the last. I set my bags down carefully in the entryway, the thud of their weight punctuating the silence that spread through the house. The dining room was visible from where I stood. Plates sat in neat arrangements, crumbs and wine stains marking the remains of a feast. The chairs were filled, Roy with his glass of red wine, Lindsay still fussing over Emma's napkin. Martin's parents seated comfortably. Not one chair sat empty. Not one place setting was waiting for me. Roger. Roy rose from his seat, his deep voice filled with genuine surprise. We had no idea you were still at the airport. Lindsay followed her concern written plainly across her face. You poor thing. You must be exhausted. I looked at Victoria. 35 calls, I said quietly, the words heavy as stone. 35, Victoria. Not one answered. The room fell silent. Martin shifted uncomfortably in the doorway, his hand gripping the back of a chair as though it might anchor him. Victoria's face drained of color, her knuckles white around her wine glass. We were just about to leave, she said quickly, her voice trembling now. Weren't we, Martin? He mumbled something about technical problems, but the truth was written all over his face. They hadn't been coming for me at all. I glanced at the dining table again, at the plates cleared, the wine half drunk, the laughter that had filled the house before my arrival. And in that moment, I knew with certainty this was no accident. This was a plan. Roy stepped forward, his expression one of measured concern, the kind of look I had seen him wear from the bench when he listened to testimony as a federal judge. Roger, he said, his tone calm but steady. If you had been waiting at the airport, why didn't someone call us? We would have gone to get you ourselves. His words carried no judgment, only confusion, and that hurt even more. I looked at him and Lindsay, people who had welcomed me into their home countless times, people who showed more warmth in that moment than my own daughter had in the past 7 hours. I didn't have your number memorized. I admitted, my voice heavy, and I kept thinking someone would answer when I called. 35 times I tried. I let the number hang in the air, the silence afterward sharp enough to cut. Lindsay's hand flew to her chest. Oh my goodness, Roger. You were at the airport all that time. Her eyes glistened with sympathy, the kind of maternal instinct that once had been Margaret's domain. She turned a sharp gaze on Victoria. Why didn't you tell us Victoria's smile was thin, brittle? It was just a miscommunication. We thought Dad's flight was delayed until tomorrow morning. Roy frowned, his brows knitting. That doesn't match what I was told earlier. You said his flight had already landed this afternoon. His eyes flicked between his daughter-in-law and me, the logic already unraveling in his mind. Martin cleared his throat but said nothing, his shoulders hunched as though bracing for impact. He reached for his wine glass, but his hand shook just enough to make the crystal clink against the plate. I stayed quiet, letting the weight of the truth do the work. Years of parenting had taught me that sometimes silence was louder than shouting. I watched as Roy studied his daughter-in-law, his face darkening by degrees. Lindsay, meanwhile, crossed her arms and fixed Victoria with a look only a teacher could muster, a mixture of disappointment and moral outrage. It's not what it looks like, Victoria said quickly, her voice rising. We were going to get him. Honestly, things just got mixed up. Mixed up, I repeated, my voice low, calm, but sharp. I gestured toward the dining table where the dishes sat stacked, the wine bottles half empty. That table was set for exactly the number of people in this room. Not one chair extra, not one plate waiting. The words landed like blows. Roy's lips pressed into a tight line, his gaze shifting back to Victoria. Martin sank lower in his chair, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Emma giggled softly at something Lindsay whispered to her, innocent and oblivious to the storm unfolding around her. Victoria laughed nervously, the sound grating desperate. Dad's fine. Aren't you, Dad? Just a little confusion with the cars. You know how crazy Christmas travel can be. I didn't answer. My silence filled the space, forcing her to stumble further into her web of excuses. And as Roy leaned back in his chair, arms folded, and Lindsay shook her head slowly, I realized something in this room. The only people still trying to shield me with dignity weren't my daughter or her husband. It was the in-laws. And that, more than the long hours at the airport, broke my heart. I excused myself quietly, setting down my fork and murmuring something about needing the restroom. Lindsay pointed me down the hall, her kind smile almost a balm, though my chest felt heavy with everything left unsaid. My shoes sank into the thick carpet, muffling my steps, but as I approached the half-closed bathroom door, voices from the kitchen froze me in place. It was Victoria and Martin. I really wish he hadn't shown up tonight. Martin said, his voice stripped of any pretense, laced with irritation. My hand froze on the doorknob. Victoria sighed, almost in agreement. You know how he is. Always telling those silly stories about his little auto parts, stores like he built Microsoft or something. It's embarrassing in front of my parents. The words struck harder than any winter wind. 30 years of sweat and sacrifice, of 16-hour days and missed weekends, reduced to silly stories. 12 locations built from a $5,000 loan, countless nights. Margaret and I worked side by side, all belittled in a single dismissive sentence. Martin's voice lowered, but I caught every syllable. Your dad just doesn't know how to behave around people like Roy and Lindsay. His mannerisms, his talk, it's awkward. I was hoping if we ignored him long enough today, he'd just give up and go home. My grip tightened on the doorframe until my knuckles whitened. The sting in my chest burned like fire. Victoria let out a soft laugh. Maybe next Christmas we just don't invite him at all. Tell him we're out of town. He'll get the hint eventually. The casual cruelty in her tone almost buckled my knees. Each word was a knife. Then came the worst blow of all. At least the money situation will be settled soon, she continued, her voice practical, almost cheerful. Once well, you know, the inheritance. Then we won't have to pretend anymore. Silence roared in my ears. They weren't just embarrassed by me, they were waiting for me to die. My daughter, my only child, speaking of my death like it was a financial windfall. The emerald necklace in my pocket suddenly felt like a cruel joke. Margaret's memory, my love, my legacy, all mocked by the very person meant to carry them forward. Something inside me hardened in that moment. The grief-stricken father who had waited 13 hours at the airport gave way to someone colder, sharper. A man who finally saw the truth. My daughter valued money more than her father. I stepped back from the doorway, steadying myself. My breath came in shallow gasps, but clarity settled like steel in my spine. The envelopes in my pocket, $175, meant as gifts, would no longer be symbols of love. They would be tools, weapons, even to reclaim my dignity. I had heard enough. Turning on my heel, I let my footsteps fall deliberately loud as I headed back toward the dining room. If Victoria and Martin thought I would slink away quietly, they were about to learn otherwise. My footsteps echoed deliberately as I walked back toward the dining room, each one heavier than the last. When I entered, Victoria and Martin were still in the kitchen, stacking dishes, unaware that the mask was about to be ripped away. They looked up when they heard me. Victoria's face shifted into that brittle smile she always wore when trying to cover discomfort. "Dad," she said lightly, almost too casually, "everything all right?" I stopped in the doorway, the gift bags neatly arranged by the table at my side, the emerald necklace box pressing against my chest like a stone. I met her eyes and spoke with a steadiness I didn't feel. "I heard every single word you just said." The dish in her hand slipped, and Martin barely caught it before it shattered. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Victoria stammered, "Dad, you don't understand. You must have misheard. I stepped into the room, my voice low but rising with each word. 13 hours in an airport. 35 unanswered calls. And then I hear my own daughter laughing about how I embarrass her. About how you'll stop inviting me to Christmas. About how you're waiting for me to die so you can get my inheritance." Martin took a step back, bumping into the counter. His face drained of color. It wasn't like that," he mumbled. "Don't lie to me." My voice cracked, but not from weakness. From the sheer weight of decades of disappointment crashing down at once. I built 12 stores from nothing. I worked every day of my life so Victoria could have what I never did. And you reduce that to silly stories. You talk about me like I'm some shameful relic you have to hide. The kitchen had gone silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Then footsteps approached. Roy and Lindsay entered, drawn by the rising tension. Roy's sharp eyes scanned the scene like a man piecing together testimony. Lindsay's hand covered her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. "Is everything all right?" Roy asked carefully, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "No, Roy," I said, my voice steady now. "It isn't." I turned back to Victoria. "Tell them what you just said. Tell them how you and your husband planned to keep me away. Tell them how you laughed at my life's work. Tell them how you discussed my death like it was nothing more than a business arrangement." Victoria's face twisted, her words tumbling out in desperation. "Dad, please, we didn't mean it like that. It was just stress talking. You know we love you." Love, the word cut through the air like a blade. Love doesn't leave a father stranded at an airport for half a day. Love doesn't silence 35 calls. Love doesn't plan holidays to erase the very man who gave you everything. Roy's face had gone crimson, his jaw tight. Lindsay shook her head, her voice trembling with indignation. "Victoria, how could you, on Christmas of all nights?" For the first time in years, the power shifted. Victoria and Martin weren't in control anymore. I was. And as I looked at Roy and Lindsay, people who still knew the meaning of respect, I realized the confrontation had only just begun. I carried the weight of silence back into the dining room, my gift bags trailing like loyal sentries at my side. Roy and Lindsay followed close behind, their faces etched with unease. Victoria and Martin hesitated in the kitchen doorway, caught between fleeing and facing what was coming. I sat down at the table, deliberately sliding into a chair, as though I owned every inch of the house my money had helped them buy. Roy gestured toward me, his judicial instincts sharpening. "Roger," he said carefully, "tell us what's going on." I folded my hands in front of me. My voice was calm, but it carried an edge honed from years of holding my tongue. What's going on is simple. I waited at the airport for 13 hours today. I called my daughter 35 times. I sat alone on Christmas while families around me reunited. And do you know what I discovered when I finally came here? That they never intended to pick me up at all. The room went still. The clink of Emma's spoon against her plate was the only sound. Martin shifted uneasily, his eyes darting between Roy and me. "Dad," Victoria started, her voice high, her smile brittle. "You've misunderstood." I cut her off. "I didn't misunderstand a thing. I stood in that hallway and heard you. Every word." I turned to Roy and Lindsay, my gaze unwavering. I heard my daughter laugh about my life's work, dismissing 30 years of building 12 stores as if it were a joke. I heard them plan to never invite me to Christmas again. And I heard them talk about my death as a financial opportunity. Lindsay gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Roy's eyes darkened, the kind of look that once froze defendants in their tracks. He turned slowly toward Victoria. Is that true? Victoria's composure faltered. Her cheeks flushed and her hands trembled around her wine glass. It was just talk, she stammered. Stress. We didn't mean it. Stress doesn't make people plot their father's exclusion, I said, my voice rising now. Stress doesn't turn love into a waiting game for inheritance. That isn't stress, Victoria. That's contempt. Martin tried to speak, but his words came out garbled. We were just joking, trying to lighten the mood. Joking. I leaned forward, my eyes fixed on him. 13 hours in an airport. 35 unanswered calls. Does that sound like a joke to you? Roy's fist clenched against the table. This is unconscionable, he said, his voice low with restrained fury. Roger deserved respect. At the very least, honesty. Victoria's face crumpled. She reached toward me, her voice breaking. Dad, please, don't do this. You're twisting it. No, I interrupted, standing now, my voice carrying the authority of every sacrifice I had made. For once in your life, Victoria, you're going to face the truth. Tonight, everyone sees you for who you are, and there will be no twisting that. The room sat frozen, the crack in her mask, wide enough now that no excuse could seal it again. And for the first time in years, I wasn't the one on trial. She was. Roy leaned back in his chair, folding his hands the way I had seen him do 100 times in courtrooms. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp, dissecting every twitch and hesitation. Victoria, he began slowly, his voice measured earlier this evening. You told us your father's flight was delayed until tomorrow morning. Now he tells us he landed at 2:47 p.m. and spent 13 hours at the airport. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a deliberate misrepresentation. Why, Victoria's cheeks flushed crimson. She fumbled with her glass, setting it down too quickly, the clink echoing in the tense room. I must have misread the itinerary. You know how holiday travel gets confusing. Roy raised an eyebrow. Confusing, you had his itinerary weeks in advance, and your husband confirmed the time when I asked before dinner. His voice hardened. This was no mistake. Martin's head jerked up, his eyes darting to Victoria. For a brief second, I saw the panic flash across his face. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Lindsay shook her head slowly, disappointment clouding her expression. Victoria, dear, your father deserves honesty. If you did not want him here tonight, you should have told him, not abandoned him in an airport on Christmas. Victoria's voice pitched higher, brittle and desperate. It wasn't like that. We were planning to get him later after dinner. Things just got out of hand. After dinner, I cut in, my tone sharp. The table was set for exactly the number of people already here. No empty chair, no plate waiting. Stop pretending this was anything but deliberate. Roy nodded gravely. Your father is right. The evidence doesn't lie. He turned his piercing gaze back on Victoria, and then there's the matter of what he overheard. The blood drained from her face. He must have misheard. Roy's voice cracked like a gavel. Enough. I know the difference between a misheard word and a damning statement. He heard you belittle his business. He heard you suggest excluding him from future Christmas gatherings. And worst of all, he heard you discuss his inheritance as though his life were nothing more than a ledger to balance. That is not mishearing. That is betrayal. The room fell silent except for the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. Victoria's hand trembled as she reached for Martin's arm, but he pulled away slightly, unwilling to share in the fire now directed at her. I sat back in my chair, my heart pounding but steady. For years I had excused her behavior, softened her edges in my mind, told myself she was just stressed, just distracted, just young. But hearing Roy dismantle her excuses with the precision of a judge watching Lindsay's face twist with shame on my behalf, I knew the truth was finally out in the open. Victoria tried one last pitiful attempt. "Dad, please, I didn't mean any of it. You know I love you." I stared at her for a long moment. Love doesn't abandon someone for 13 hours. Love doesn't laugh about their life's work. Love doesn't wait for their death like a payday. Don't you dare call that love. Her lips trembled, but no defense came. Roy had cornered her, and this time, there was no escaping the verdict. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock. Then slowly, I reached into my coat pocket. My fingers brushed against the stiff edges of the envelopes I had carried since morning, the very ones that had pressed against my ribs like a secret. I pulled them out deliberately, letting the weight of the paper rest in my hand. "These," I said, holding them up so everyone could see, "were meant to be your Christmas presents." Victoria's eyes flickered with confusion, then widened when she saw the bank's insignia stamped across the letterhead. Martin leaned forward instinctively, his curiosity betraying him before he caught himself. Roy and Lindsay exchanged glances, their faces solemn. I set the first envelope on the table, tapping it with my finger. This one, Victoria held a certified check for $50,000. I thought maybe it would ease the strain of bills or give you the chance to take that European trip you once dreamed about. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. I placed the second envelope beside it. This one was for Martin, the same amount. Because even though you've treated me like an outsider tonight, I wanted to show him he was just as much a part of this family. Martin's face flushed, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. Finally, I set the third envelope down with a firm hand. And this one was for Emma. $75,000 in an education fund. A promise I made to Margaret before she passed. She wanted her granddaughter to have opportunities we never could have imagined. That promise has guided me every day since. The envelope sat there stark against the polished wood, more damning than any words I could speak. The room was utterly still. Emma, too young to understand, reached for her doll and hummed softly to herself, the innocence of her small voice making the silence sharper. I leaned back, folding my arms. $175,000. That's what I carried through an airport for 13 hours. That's what sat in my coat pocket while I ate a cold sandwich alone. That's what I nearly handed over tonight until I heard the truth in that hallway. Victoria's hands shook as she reached out, but I pulled the envelopes back, slipping them safely into my coat again. "Not anymore," I said, my tone final. "Dad, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You can't mean that. We just made a mistake." I looked at her, my jaw tight. A mistake is forgetting to set another place at the table. A mistake is losing track of time. What you did was intentional. You abandoned me. You mocked me. And you plotted to erase me while waiting for my death. That isn't a mistake, it's a choice. Roy exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Victoria, this is beyond shameful. I've seen defendants in court treat strangers with more decency than you've shown your own father." The envelopes weighed heavy in my pocket again, but this time the burden wasn't grief. It was clarity. For once, the evidence of my love wasn't theirs to squander. I let the silence stretch as I slipped the envelopes back into my coat. The sound of paper against fabric was louder than any scream. When I looked up, Victoria's eyes were wide, shimmering with panic. Martin's hands twitched on the table as though he were restraining himself from grabbing the envelopes outright. "You wanted my money," I said evenly, my voice low but steady. "You've treated my love as if it were nothing more than currency. Well, tonight you've proven that's all it ever meant to you. So let me be clear, these checks will never be yours. Not now. Not ever. Victoria shot to her feet, her chair scraping hard against the wood floor. Dad, you can't do that. You don't mean it. You're angry, that's all. I met her desperation with calm resolve. I've never been clearer in my life. Martin finally spoke, his tone shaky but insistent. Roger, think about Emma. She shouldn't suffer because of I cut him off. Emma will be taken care of. Her education, her future, that promise stands. But not through you. Not through parents who can abandon their own father on Christmas and then laugh about his death like a windfall. Lindsay gasped softly. Roy's gaze was locked on me, nodding slowly, as though I were a witness finally testifying to a truth long hidden. You've mocked me for telling stories about my business, I continued, my voice rising, years of swallowed pride now pouring out. But that little auto parts store put you through college, Victoria. It paid for your graduate school. It covered your sorority fees, your study abroad in Italy. It bought your wedding dress and the down payment on this house. And in return, you stranded me at an airport for 13 hours and plotted to erase me from your life. Victoria's tears spilled over, now her voice shrill. Dad, stop. You don't understand, we were just venting. We didn't mean it. Roy's voice cut in cold as steel. Enough. Roger understands perfectly. And so do I. He turned to Victoria, his tone carrying the weight of a gavel. What you did tonight was not venting. It was cruelty. Calculated cruelty. Victoria's shoulders shook. She looked at me with the eyes of a cornered child, but I saw no innocence left there. Only regret that her schemes had been exposed. I stood reaching for my coat. For years I believed love meant giving. Tonight I learned that giving without respect isn't love, it's servitude. And I am done serving people who see me as nothing more than a bank account. The words hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Martin slumped into his chair, staring at the floor. Victoria covered her face with trembling hands. I pulled the envelopes tight against my chest. The inheritance you counted on, nearly $3 million, is gone. You've lost it all tonight. Not because I'm angry, but because you've shown me who you really are. The crack of truth echoed through the room louder than any Christmas carol. The room was heavy with silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the faint sound of Emma humming to her doll. I stood at the head of the table, the gift bags lined at my feet, like colorful reminders of what might have been. Victoria's sobs were muffled behind her hands, while Martin sat slumped, staring at his half-empty glass, as if he could drown in it. Lindsay rose, her face pale with indignation. Roger, I can't imagine the pain you've endured tonight. I am ashamed on their behalf. Her eyes flicked toward Victoria with a sharpness I'd never seen from her before. No father should be treated this way. Roy nodded gravely, his arms crossed. Your father's right, he said, his tone cold and judicial. What you've done tonight isn't just thoughtless, it's deliberate cruelty. I've presided over cases where strangers showed more respect to one another than you've shown to the man who raised you. Victoria dropped her hands, her face blotched red from tears and panic. Dad, please, she pleaded, her voice trembling. We can fix this. We can make it right. Don't do anything permanent. We were just overwhelmed and we said things we didn't mean. I bent down and picked up the burgundy gift bag, the one meant for her. Slowly, I pulled out the velvet box and held it up so the light caught the emeralds within. They glimmered with the weight of 3 generations, Margaret's mother, Margaret herself. And now I had thought Victoria. Do you see this? I asked, my voice cutting through her pleas. This necklace carried the strength and grace of the women before you. It was meant to bind you to a legacy of love. But tonight it sits as nothing more than a trinket in the hands of a woman who doesn't understand what legacy means. Her eyes followed the necklace, desperate, hungry, but I snapped the box shut with finality and slid it back into the bag. You don't deserve it. Not now. Maybe not ever. Martin straightened, suddenly his voice sharp. Roger, you're overreacting. We all say things we don't mean. Don't throw away family over one bad night. I turned to him, my voice calm but cutting. Family doesn't leave me in an airport on Christmas. Family doesn't laugh about my life's work. Family doesn't treat my death like a payday. You don't get to redefine the word to suit your greed. Roy's voice rumbled in agreement. Well said. I gathered the bags one by one, the handles biting into my palms. Each thud as I set them against my leg echoed like a verdict. These were gifts, I said slowly, scanning their faces. Tonight they've become evidence. Evidence of how far love can be twisted before it breaks. Victoria collapsed back into her chair, her sobs shaking her shoulders. Martin sat, rigid lips pressed tight, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Roy and Lindsay watched in silence, their faces grave as though attending a sentencing. I slipped into my coat, the envelopes heavy against my chest. This was your Christmas, I said quietly. And tonight you lost far more than presents. You lost my trust. You lost my inheritance. And you may have lost me. Without another word, I turned and walked out the door. The cold winter air bit my face, but it felt cleaner than the warmth I had left behind. For the first time that night, I felt free. The front door closed behind me with a soft click, but it might as well have been a gavel. The laughter and voices I had once longed to be part of were sealed away on the other side, muffled into nothing more than distant noise. I stood there on the porch, my bags weighing heavy in my hands, the winter air slicing across my face. For a moment, I didn't move. I just let the cold settle into my bones, sharper than the humiliation I had just endured, but somehow cleaner. Snowflakes spun under the glow of the porch light, catching in my hair and dusting the shoulders of my coat. I took a long breath and let it out slowly. For 13 hours, I had waited to be welcomed into warmth. Now, standing outside in the bitter cold, I realized this emptiness was better than their false embrace. The taxi was still idling at the curb. The driver, James, leaned across the seat, his kind eyes searching mine as I trudged down the walkway. He stepped out to help with the bags without a word. His silence was more comforting than anything Victoria had said all night. Back to the airport, he asked quietly. I shook my head. No, not the airport. My voice surprised me, steady, certain, not the voice of a man who had been begging for scraps of affection hours earlier. Take me downtown, Ritz-Carlton. He raised his eyebrows but nodded, loading the bags into the trunk. Yes, sir. I slid into the back seat, the heater humming against my frozen fingers. Through the window, I glanced one last time at Victoria's house. Warm light glowed through the windows, silhouettes moved inside, but to me it looked hollow. That wasn't my home. It never had been, not really. It was a place I had financed, furnished with my sacrifices, but it had never held space for me. As the taxi pulled away, I let my head rest against the seat. The emerald necklace shifted in the bag beside me, its velvet box pressing against the fabric. Margaret's voice came back to me, soft but resolute. Promise me you'll make sure she remembers where she came from. I had kept that promise longer than I should have. I had carried Victoria with my strength, my sacrifices, my money. Tonight I realized the only person who needed remembering was me. The city lights came into view, Denver glowing against the snowy night. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about what more I could give away. I was thinking about what I could finally give myself. A room that didn't reek of pity, a night that wasn't tainted by disappointment, a future not dictated by a daughter's entitlement. As James turned onto the highway, I leaned forward and said, "Take the scenic route. I want to see the city." He smiled in the mirror. "You got it." I sat back and watched the light sweep past the burden on my chest, lifting. Walking away wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The Ritz-Carlton lobby glowed like another world when James pulled the taxi to the curb. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above polished marble floors, and a doorman hurried forward to relieve me of my bags. His smile was warm, practiced, but sincere in a way I hadn't felt in years. It struck me that this stranger paid to greet weary travelers showed me more respect in 30 seconds than my daughter had in 13 hours. Inside, the scent of pine and cinnamon drifted through the air, subtle yet inviting. A towering Christmas tree adorned with gold ornaments and soft white lights dominated the center of the lobby. Families milled about children, staring up in awe, couples taking photos, voices carrying with the easy joy of people who belonged. For once, I didn't feel like an outsider. I was simply a man checking into a hotel, no strings attached, no unspoken judgment. At the reception desk, a young woman with kind eyes looked up. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Ritz-Carlton, Denver. How may I assist you tonight?" I straightened my shoulders. "I'll need accommodations for an extended stay. At least a month, possibly longer." My voice carried a confidence I hadn't heard in myself for years. Her fingers danced across the keyboard. "Of course, sir. We have a corner suite available with long-term rates. Would you like us to include meal packages and concierge services?" "Yes," I said firmly. "The finest you have. Money is no object." She smiled genuinely. "We'll make sure your stay is exceptional." The word settled over me like a balm. Exceptional. Not tolerated. Not endured. Not pitied. Exceptional. For decades, I had poured myself into making others' lives easier, employees, customers, and above all, Victoria. I had waited for her gratitude, for recognition, for love. It never came. And here, in a matter of minutes, strangers treated me with a dignity my own blood had denied me. A bellman led me to the elevator and up to my suite. When the door opened, I paused at the threshold. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the Denver skyline stretching toward the mountains, the city glowing against the snowy night. A mahogany desk, a leather armchair, a king-sized bed dressed in crisp linens, all of it radiated comfort without condition. I set my suitcase down and walked straight to the window. My reflection stared back at me, tired but unbroken, a man who had carried far too much for far too long. The gift bags sat by the door, still filled with the trinkets I had once thought would buy me a seat at a table. Tonight they were no longer burdens. They were reminders of what I had escaped. For the first time in years, I wasn't calculating someone else's needs. I wasn't wondering if Victoria was happy, if Martin was satisfied, if Emma was impressed. Instead, I thought of myself, of Margaret and the life we had dreamed of, but never taken the vineyards of Tuscany, the art museums of Paris, the seaside towns of Spain. I turned away from the window, my decision settling in. My life wasn't ending in betrayal. It was beginning again with me. The suite was silent except for the hum of the city below. I sat at the desk, a glass of water in hand, when my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a name that used to bring me comfort. Victoria. The message read, "Dad, please call. We can work this out." I stared at it, my thumb hovering. Hours ago, those words would have been enough to make me forgive anything. But now they rang hollow, stripped of sincerity. Work this out. After 13 hours of silence, 35 unanswered calls and words I could never unhear. That bridge had burned to ash. Without hesitation, I pressed delete. The message vanished, and with it the last illusion that she valued me for who I was. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was liberating. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. I opened it to find the concierge, a gentleman in his 40s, with a professional smile. "Good evening, Mr. Baker," he said, carrying a sleek leather portfolio. "I understand you'd like assistance planning some travel." I invited him in, gesturing to the desk. "Yes. I've postponed too much of my life already. It's time to change that." He laid out brochures and opened a tablet, scrolling through destinations. "Do you have specific regions in mind?" I thought of Margaret, of her voice late at night when she'd talk about the places she wished we had visited together. "Promise me, Roger, don't just work. See the world." I had promised, and then buried that dream beneath overtime shifts and obligations. "Italy," I said firmly. "Tuscany, Venice, Rome. Then France, the Loire Valley, Paris, the Riviera. After that, Spain. I want to see the coastal cities, the art, the history." The concierge nodded, jotting notes. "First-class accommodations, private tours, fine dining experiences." "All of it," I replied. For once, I didn't feel guilty about saying yes. He smiled. "Excellent. We'll tailor a package that allows you to enjoy every detail without stress. You've earned it." Earned. That word lodged in my chest. For years, I had been told directly and indirectly that I wasn't enough, that my stories were small, my work unimpressive, my manners embarrassing. Yet here was a stranger who, without knowing my history, spoke the truth. I had earned this. 30 years of sweat, of building something from nothing, of sacrificing vacations and hobbies for family. Even if Victoria never acknowledged it, the truth remained. As the concierge gathered his notes, he added, "We'll have an itinerary for you tomorrow morning. In the meantime, I suggest you rest. The world is waiting." After he left, I walked back to the window. Denver stretched out before me, glittering under the snow. For the first time in decades, the future didn't look like an obligation. It looked like freedom. And as I stood there, phone silent, bags untouched, I whispered to Margaret, "We're finally going, love. Just me this time. But we're going." I settled into the leather chair by the mahogany desk, the hotel's gold pen cool between my fingers. The concierge's portfolio lay open, filled with glossy pages of vineyards, sunlit coastlines, and cobblestone streets. I smoothed a sheet of hotel stationery, and for the first time in years began to write not about expenses or responsibilities, but about dreams. At the top, I wrote one word, Margaret. I could almost hear her laugh, that soft chime that used to carry through our shop on busy Fridays when she brought cookies for the employees. She had always dreamed bigger than me. Where I saw numbers and invoices, she saw possibilities. She wanted to walk through the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, to taste wine under a Tuscan sun, to hear Spanish guitars echoing through narrow streets at night. She never asked for jewelry or fancy cars. She wanted experiences, memories. And I, blinded by duty, kept promising someday. Someday had turned into never, until now. I began making a list. Spring in Italy, Tuscany, Florence, Venice. Walk the vineyards, take in art, sight at a cafe with nothing but time. Summer in France, Loire Valley castles, Paris museums, the Riviera's sparkling coast. Fine dining, music, history, alive on every street. Fall in Spain, Barcelona, Seville, Granada. Flamenco nights, Moorish palaces, Mediterranean sunsets. Winter anywhere, warmth calls. The list grew, and with each destination, the weight in my chest eased. It wasn't guilt pushing me anymore. It was excitement. I paused and looked at the envelopes in my coat pocket, still heavy with $175,000. Hours earlier, I had seen them as gifts for others, proof of my devotion. Now they felt different. They weren't meant to buy affection anymore. They were keys to unlock the life I had denied myself. For once, I would invest in me. I glanced toward the gift bags by the door. The emerald necklace sat buried beneath burgundy tissue paper, once destined for Victoria's throat. My hand brushed over the bag absently, and I smiled sadly. The necklace wasn't wasted. It wasn't lost. It was simply waiting for someone who would value not just the stones, but the story. Perhaps one day Emma would grow to understand, but only if she learned what her parents clearly hadn't: love is measured by respect, not inheritance. Leaning back, I closed my eyes. The steady hum of the city below felt alive, vibrant. For the first time in years, my pulse quickened, not with stress, but with anticipation. I imagined stepping into Florence, breathing in history. I pictured Margaret at my side, her eyes wide with wonder, her arm looped through mine. She wasn't here, but in some way she was woven into every dream I was finally brave enough to chase. When I opened my eyes again, the paper before me was filled with plans. My handwriting, shaky but determined, declared a truth I'd buried too long. I wasn't done living. No, I was just beginning. The city stretched out beneath me like a blanket of stars, Denver's lights glowing against the dark winter sky. I sat by the window in the corner suite, a steaming cup of coffee in my hands, the warmth seeping into fingers still stiff from the cold of that porch. Snow continued to fall, swirling around the glass, softening the edges of the skyline. It should have been a lonely view. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something new. For years, I had convinced myself that Christmas meant giving until there was nothing left to give. I thought if I kept sacrificing money, time, even dignity, Victoria would one day look at me with gratitude. Tonight, the illusion shattered, and strangely in its place came peace. My phone lay silent on the table beside me. No buzzing, no texts, no desperate apologies that might have once pulled me back into her orbit. Hours earlier, that silence would have been unbearable. Now it was a blessing. It meant I owed no one an answer, no one an explanation. For the first time in decades, I was free of expectation. I leaned forward, pressing my palm against the cool glass. Somewhere out there, Victoria and Martin were likely arguing, spinning excuses, maybe even regretting the exposure of their cruelty. But their reckoning was no longer my burden. Tonight, my only responsibility was to myself. I thought of Margaret again. I could almost see her reflection beside mine in the glass, smiling with that quiet encouragement she always carried. "Go, Roger," I imagined her saying. "You've done enough for them. Now it's time for you." I whispered back into the empty room, "I hear you, love, and I'm going." I pulled out the list I had scribbled earlier. Tuscany in spring, Paris in summer, Spain in fall, and beyond that, wherever my heart led me. I saw myself walking cobblestone streets with no one to rush me, sitting in vineyards, sipping wine, telling my story, not as a plea for validation, but as a celebration of survival. I pictured mornings where I woke not to obligations, but to possibility. The checks in my coat pocket felt heavier than ever, but not as gifts denied, as investments reclaimed. Every dollar that might have gone to people who despised me would now fund a life they could never touch, a life of beauty, freedom, and dignity. Outside, a car horn echoed faintly, then faded into the hum of the city. I sipped my coffee, savoring its warmth. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a man left behind. I felt like a man stepping forward. Christmas had always been about giving. Tonight I learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give is to yourself. I set the cup down, turned from the window, and let a smile tug at the corners of my mouth. This year, I hadn't lost Christmas. I had finally found it. Looking back, that Christmas taught me more than any gift ever could. I learned that love without respect is hollow, and that sometimes the hardest truth to face is that blood alone doesn't make family. I gave my daughter everything: education, a home, opportunities I never had. But what she truly wanted was my absence until she could collect what I left behind. In that betrayal, I finally saw the truth: my worth isn't measured by what others take from me, but by how I choose to live. And so I walked away. Not in anger, but in clarity. The money that was once meant to buy their affection now funds something far more valuable: my freedom, my dignity, and the chance to live the life Margaret and I once dreamed of. I don't regret giving, but I no longer give to those who treat my sacrifices as their entitlement. If there's a lesson here, it's this: no matter your age, it's never too late to reclaim your worth. Sometimes walking away is the most powerful act of love you can give yourself. Now I want to ask you, have you ever faced a moment where family betrayed your trust? How did you handle it? And what did you learn? Share your story in the comments. If this touched you, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for listening, and remember, respect is the greatest inheritance we can leave behind.